There is a version of history in which the greatest tournament ever played never happened at all, dismantled by politics and fear before a single ball was kicked. What survived was something no one had planned for and no one was fully prepared to witness. By the time the tournament ended 12 matches into its final rounds, the world of football had been cracked open like a chest, and what spilled out changed everything that came after. The year was 1958, and Sweden was about to host a storm it never saw coming. The road to Sweden had begun years earlier in the corridors of FIFA, where the decision to award the tournament to a Scandinavian nation was itself a political act, a deliberate choice to find neutral ground in a Europe still fractured by the memory of the Second World War. Sweden was quiet, orderly, and politically unaligned in the gathering storm of the Cold War. But the qualification process that preceded the tournament was a minefield of geopolitics. The Soviet Union and its satellite states participated for the first time in World Cup history, bringing with them not just footballers but the full weight of ideological symbolism. Every match involving an Eastern Bloc nation carried a meaning that stretched far beyond the pitch. Turkey, Spain, and several other nations navigated complex political decisions about whether to compete at all, with some withdrawing under pressure that had nothing to do with football. The 16 nations that eventually gathered in Sweden were not simply the best 16 available. They were the 16 who had survived a qualification labyrinth shaped as much by history as by talent. Sweden itself was in the midst of a quiet social transformation, a prosperous and modern nation beginning to shed its post-war conservatism. The arrival of footballers from Brazil, the Soviet Union, France, and West Germany would expose Swedish towns and cities to an explosion of styles, sounds, and cultures they had never encountered at this scale. Brazil arrived in Sweden carrying a wound they had never spoken aloud. 8 years earlier at the Maracanã in Rio de Janeiro, 200,000 of their own people had watched them collapse against Uruguay in the final match of the 1950 World Cup. The defeat was so devastating that Brazilians did not speak of it openly for decades. It had a name, the Maracanazo. The psychological weight of that loss had shaped an entire generation of Brazilian football. By 1958, the national team had hired a psychologist named João Carvalhais to test the mental fitness of every player in the squad, one of the first documented uses of sports psychology at a World Cup. His conclusions about several of the most important players were deeply alarming. The psychologist concluded that one 17-year-old in particular was too immature, too infantile in his emotional responses, and too lacking in the fighting spirit required for international football. He recommended this player not be selected. The Brazilian coaching staff received the report, read it carefully, and then quietly ignored it entirely. If you have followed football long enough, you know that its greatest stories are almost always the ones that nearly did not happen. Subscribe to Football Untold so you never miss the story's history buried beneath the final scoreline. West Germany arrived as defending champions, having shocked the football world in 1954 with their famous victory over the mighty Hungarians in what became known as the Miracle of Bern. The Germans were disciplined, physically dominant, and deeply confident. They expected to defend their title with the quiet authority of a nation that had rebuilt itself from ruins. France came with perhaps the most devastating attacking trio in the tournament, led by a center-forward from Morocco named Just Fontaine who had only been included in the squad because another player was injured. He would go on to do something at this tournament that no one has ever replicated in the history of the World Cup, before or since. The group stage began on the 8th of June 1958, and within the first days it was clear that this would be no ordinary tournament. Brazil opened against Austria and won convincingly, but what caught the eye of observers was not the result but the method. The Brazilians played with a rhythm and spontaneity that European football had no language to describe. Their tactical system, developed by coach Vicente Fiala, was a revolutionary 4-2-4 formation that flooded the attack with creative players while maintaining defensive stability in a way European teams were simply not prepared for. Football had been largely played with a heavy reliance on center forwards and wingers in rigid positions. Brazil played as if the positions themselves were suggestions. But it was in the quarter-final stage that the tournament began to reveal its hidden characters. Wales, a nation of fewer than 3 million people, had qualified through one of the most improbable routes in World Cup history, entering an African playoff after other nations withdrew and scraping through on the narrowest of margins. Wales had drawn all three of their group matches and qualified for the knockout stage as one of the best third-placed teams, meaning they had technically never won a match in the tournament. Their goalkeeper Jack Kelsey was considered one of the finest in the world and had kept his side alive almost single-handedly through sheer brilliance between the posts. In the quarter-final, Wales faced Brazil. For 66 minutes the Welsh goalkeeper Kelsey was a force of nature, repelling everything the Brazilians threw at him. Then a 17-year-old boy received the ball with his back to goal, flicked it up with his heel, spun, and volleyed it into the net in a single movement so fluid that several journalists in the press box thought they had imagined it. It was the only goal of the match, and it was the only goal of the entire tournament scored by that 17-year-old who had been deemed psychologically unfit for international football. His name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento, and the world would soon know him only as Pelé. But to reduce the 1958 World Cup to a single teenager would be to repeat the same mistake every history book has made. Just Fontaine of France was dismantling records with a calm precision that seemed almost mechanical. In 13 total games across the tournament he scored 13 goals, a record that has stood for 66 years and may never be broken. The semi-final between Brazil and France was the collision the tournament had been building toward. France with their lethal Fontaine, Brazil with their 17-year-old prodigy and a team that moved like music. What unfolded was one of the great forgotten matches in World Cup history, a 5-2 victory for Brazil in which the young striker from Três Corações scored a hat-trick. Sweden reached the final as hosts, carried by a wave of extraordinary national pride and the brilliance of their forward line. The Swedish people had fallen in love with the tournament playing out on their own soil, and the prospect of their team lifting the trophy at Rosunda Stadium in Stockholm felt, for a brief and electric moment, genuinely possible. The final on the 29th of June 1958 was played before an almost entirely pro-Swedish crowd of 51,000 people. Sweden struck first, scoring inside the first 4 minutes, and for a few extraordinary seconds the stadium noise reached a pitch that rattled the very press box. Brazil had never conceded so early in a World Cup match. What happened next has been analyzed, celebrated, and retold more than almost any passage of play in football history. Brazil did not panic. They did not abandon their system. Instead they played through the Swedish crowd noise as though it were simply weather, and by the time the first half was approaching its end they had turned the match entirely on its head. Vava, Garrincha, Zagallo, Didi. These were not supporting players. Each of them carried a genius of their own. Garrincha in particular played that final with a dribbling freedom that left Swedish defenders reaching for explanations they would never find, his body feinting in directions that seemed to defy the mechanics of the human knee. The young striker scored twice in the final. His first was a chest control so delicate it looked like theft, his second a volley struck with such precision that the Swedish goalkeeper had not finished processing the first touch before the ball was already in the roof of the net. The boy who had been declared psychologically unfit finished the final with 2 goals and a performance that no one present ever fully recovered from. Brazil won 5-2. When the final whistle blew, several Brazilian players wept openly on the Rosunda pitch. They wept not just for the victory but for the wound that was finally closed, for the ghost of the Maracana in 1950 that had haunted a nation for 8 years. A young boy from Três Corações had carried that weight and put it down in Sweden. The Swedish crowd did something remarkable that no modern World Cup final crowd has quite replicated. When the Brazilian players completed their lap of honor carrying the Swedish flag in respect alongside their own, the home supporters sang and applauded with genuine warmth. It was a moment of sporting grace that the world photographed in black and white but remembered in color. Just Fontaine returned to France with 13 goals and a record that every striker since has aimed at and none has reached. He was 25 years old. Within 2 years a serious injury would end his professional career, leaving behind a record that stands not as a testament to longevity but to the terrifying intensity of what one man can do in 17 days. Jack Kelsey of Wales returned home a hero unrecognized by the wider world. A goalkeeper who had stood between his tiny nation and elimination with a brilliance that the knockout draw simply could not protect him from. Wales have never returned to a World Cup final since. That quarter-final defeat to Brazil in Gothenburg remains their greatest achievement in international football. The 1958 World Cup did not simply produce a champion. It produced a new language for football, one that would spread from Sweden back across the world and reshape how the game was taught, played, and dreamed about for generations to come. The 4-2-4 formation Brazil unveiled became the template every coach on earth eventually studied. What Sweden gave the world in the summer of 1958 was not just a tournament. It was proof that football at its highest and purest was something larger than tactics or fitness or nationality. It was a 17-year-old boy weeping on a pitch in Stockholm, held by grown men who had carried a nation's grief to another continent and finally set it down. If that story moves you, there are dozens more buried in football history waiting to be told. Follow Football Untold and make sure you are there when we find them.